January 16, 1979, Tehran's Mehrabad Airport. A Boeing 727 sits on the tarmac, engines running. Inside, a man who has ruled Iran for 37 years is about to leave his country forever. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, Shah of Iran, King of Kings, Light of the Aryans, looks out the window one last time at the country his family had controlled for half a century. He's crying. In a few hours, news of his departure will reach the streets of Tehran, and millions will pour out to celebrate. They'll dance. They'll tear down his statues. They'll burn his portraits. This is the moment everything changed. Not just for Iran, but for the entire Middle East. Because what happened next turned America's closest ally in the region into its most dedicated enemy. It created a conflict that's still shaping wars today, more than 45 years later. And here's what makes this story so fascinating. The Shah didn't fall because of a military coup. He wasn't assassinated. He wasn't overthrown by another superpower. He was brought down by his own people. By protests that started with university students and ended with millions in the streets. By cassette tapes smuggled across borders. By a religious leader who'd been in exile for 15 years and who most Western analysts had completely dismissed. The Iranian Revolution is one of the most consequential political events of the 20th century. It changed the global balance of power. It introduced a new form of government, the Islamic Republic, that had never existed before. It sparked the Iran-Iraq War, influenced the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and set the stage for decades of conflict in the Middle East. In this video, you'll discover how the CIA helped put the Shah in power in 1953. You'll understand why Iranians resented him despite oil wealth and modernization. You'll see how a revolution actually happens, step by step, from the first protests to the final collapse. You'll learn who Ayatollah Khomeini was and how he mobilized millions from exile. And you'll find out exactly what happened during the hostage crisis, those 444 days when 52 Americans were held captive in Tehran, and how that event created an enmity that has lasted generations. This is a story of power, revolution, betrayal, and unintended consequences. To understand how we got here, we need to go back to a much different Iran. An Iran where the Shah was America's best friend in the Middle East. An Iran that seemed stable, modern, and firmly in the Western camp. Let's start with the coup that made it all possible. To understand why the revolution happened, you need to know how the Shah came to have so much power in the first place. And that story begins in 1953 with one of the most consequential covert operations in CIA history. Iran in the early 1950s was not ruled by the Shah. Not really. He was the king, yes, but the real power belonged to the prime minister, a man named Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh was wildly popular. He was a nationalist who'd done something that seemed impossible at the time. He'd nationalized Iran's oil industry. For decades, Iran's oil had been controlled by the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which was essentially British. The arrangement was absurd when you think about it. Iran had some of the world's largest oil reserves, but British companies extracted it, refined it, and sold it. Iran got only 16% of the profits from its own oil. The British got the rest. Mossadegh was an aristocrat, educated in France and Switzerland, but he was also a fierce nationalist. He wore pajamas to meetings as a symbolic rejection of Western dress codes. In 1951, as prime minister, he pushed through legislation to nationalize the oil fields. Iran would control its own resources. The reaction was immediate. The British were furious. They organized a boycott of Iranian oil, sent warships to the Persian Gulf, and froze Iranian assets. They even considered a military invasion, but the Americans talked them out of it. This was 1951, and Britain was no longer the superpower it had been before World War II. The Americans were in charge now. So the British went to their American allies with a different plan. They couldn't invade Iran. but maybe they could engineer a coup. They told the Americans that Mossadegh was dangerous, that he was too close to the communists, that Iran might fall into the Soviet sphere if they didn't act. The Tudeh Party, Iran's Communist Party, was gaining influence. What if Iran became another Soviet satellite? The Americans were skeptical at first. President Truman refused to help with a coup. But in 1953, Eisenhower became president, and he was more receptive. This was the height of the Cold War. The Soviets had the atomic bomb. China had gone communist in 1949. Korea was divided. The Americans saw communist expansion everywhere, and the idea of losing Iran, with its oil and strategic location bordering the Soviet Union, was unthinkable. So the CIA and British intelligence, MI6, planned Operation Ajax. The operation was run by Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt. The plan was to turn Iranians against Mossadegh, make him look weak and dangerous, then use the Shah's constitutional power to dismiss him. If Mossadegh refused to step down, they'd use paid crowds and sympathetic military units to force him out. On August 19, 1953, it worked. CIA-organized mobs stormed through Tehran. Some were genuine anti-Mossadegh protesters. Others were paid thugs hired by the CIA. They ransacked government buildings and newspapers. Pro-Shah military units arrested Mossadegh at his home after a brief firefight. The prime minister was arrested and later tried for treason. Here's a detail most people don't know. The Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, had actually fled Iran just days before the coup, convinced it would fail. He flew to Baghdad, then to Rome. He was prepared to live in exile. Only when the CIA sent word that the coup had succeeded did he return, flying back to Tehran in triumph. The monarchy was saved. Iran's oil industry was reorganized. Instead of British control, it became an international consortium, 40% to British Petroleum, 40% to American companies, 20% to other Western firms. Iran's share of profits increased to 50%, which was better than before. But the principle of full Iranian control was lost. And Mohammad Reza Pahlavi became not just a king, but an absolute monarch with the full backing of the United States. The parliament became a rubber stamp. Political parties were restricted, and the Shah began building the apparatus of control that would define his reign. Here's the thing most people don't realize. That coup in 1953 is the reason many Iranians never trusted the Shah. It didn't matter that he modernized the country, built universities, gave women the right to vote. For millions of Iranians, he was the man the CIA put in power. He was America's puppet, and that resentment would simmer for 25 years until it exploded in 1978. The Shah took his CIA-backed power and ran with it. He wanted to transform Iran into a modern, Western-aligned superpower. He called it the White Revolution, a program of modernization that included land reform, literacy campaigns, women's rights, and industrialization. On paper, it worked. Iran's economy grew dramatically. By the mid-1970s, oil revenues were flooding in, especially after the 1973 oil crisis sent prices soaring. Tehran got modern highways, skyscrapers, a subway system. Iranian students studied in American universities. Women could vote, divorce, and work in professional jobs. But there was a dark side. To maintain control, the Shah created Savak, his secret police force. Savak was notorious. They arrested dissidents, tortured prisoners, spied on ordinary citizens. They had informants everywhere. Universities, offices, mosques, even families. Fear was the tool of control, and the modernization itself created resentment. The land reform hurt traditional landlords and religious foundations. The rapid westernization offended conservative religious Iranians who saw their values being destroyed. The wealth from oil wasn't distributed equally. Corruption was rampant among the Shah's inner circle, while many Iranians struggled. By the mid-1970s, you had a strange situation. Iran looked modern and prosperous from the outside. But underneath, there was massive discontent. Leftists hated the Shah for being an authoritarian dictator backed by America. Religious conservatives hated him for destroying traditional values. The middle class resented corruption and lack of political freedom. The working class struggled with inflation and inequality. All these groups had nothing in common except one thing. They all wanted the Shah gone. And waiting in exile, watching all of this unfold, was an elderly religious scholar named Ruhollah Khomeini. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini had been living in exile since 1964. The Shah kicked him out after Khomeini gave fiery speeches against the White Revolution, calling the Shah an American puppet who was destroying Islam in Iran. For 15 years, Khomeini lived first in Turkey, briefly, then in Iraq, in the holy city of Najaf. The Iraqi government wasn't thrilled to host him, but Najaf was one of Shia Islam's holiest cities, home to important seminaries and shrines. Khomeini settled in, taught students, and waited. Most Western analysts dismissed him. He was old, already in his 60s when exiled, now in his mid-70s. He was in exile with no army, no political organization, no apparent way to threaten the Shah's regime. The Shah himself barely thought about Khomeini. There were other opposition groups that seemed more dangerous: the Communist Today Party, the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, a Marxist-Islamist guerrilla group, liberal intellectuals. A religious scholar in Iraq? Not a priority. But Khomeini had something more powerful than an army. He had a message that resonated with millions of Iranians. And he had a new technology that seemed mundane but turned out to be revolutionary: cassette tapes. This might sound bizarre to anyone who grew up with the internet, but cassette tapes were genuinely revolutionary in the 1970s. They were small, easy to copy, easy to smuggle, and impossible for the government to fully control. Khomeini would record sermons in Najaf, speaking in clear, simple Persian that anyone could understand. His followers would smuggle the tapes into Iran, hidden in suitcases, in fruit, shipments in hollowed-out Qurans. Once in Iran, people would copy the tapes and distribute them. You could listen to Khomeini in your home, in your car, in small gatherings at the mosque or the bazaar. Savak knew it was happening but couldn't stop it. There were too many tapes, too many copies, too many people willing to risk possession. In these recordings, Khomeini spoke directly to people's frustrations. He called the Shah a tyrant. He said the monarchy was un-Islamic and illegitimate. He attacked the Shah's close relationship with America and Israel. He criticized the White Revolution's land reforms for weakening religious foundations. He promised a new kind of government based on Islamic principles, where religious scholars would guide the nation. What made Khomeini's message powerful was its clarity. While leftist groups talked about socialism and dialectical materialism, which sounded foreign and academic to many Iranians, Khomeini spoke about justice, dignity, and Islam. While liberal intellectuals called for constitutional monarchy and gradual reform, Khomeini demanded complete transformation. He united different opposition groups under one simple message: the Shah must go. By 1977, pressure was building from multiple directions. Jimmy Carter had become U.S. president and, unlike Nixon and Ford before him, was pushing the Shah to improve human rights. Carter believed American foreign policy should reflect American values. He wanted the Shah to ease up on political prisoners, allow more press freedom, reduce Savak's power. The Shah, trying to appease Carter and international criticism, loosened restrictions slightly. He allowed more open criticism in newspapers. He let some political prisoners out of jail. Political parties that had been banned were allowed to reorganize, at least on paper. That small opening was a mistake. The moment the pressure valve opened even a bit, the opposition surged through. People who'd been too afraid to speak out for years suddenly found their voices. Student groups became more active. Professional associations started publishing critical articles. Even the bazaar merchants, traditional and conservative, began openly complaining about economic policies. In January 1978, a government newspaper called Etla'at published an article attacking Khomeini. It was written anonymously, but was likely ordered by the government. The article called Khomeini a British agent, implied he wasn't even Iranian, suggesting he had Indian ancestry, and mocked his religious credentials. It was supposed to discredit him. Instead, it triggered protests. In the city of Qom, Iran's religious center, seminary students took to the streets to defend Khomeini's honor. They marched through the city chanting slogans. Police were deployed. Orders were given. Police opened fire. At least 6 students were killed, possibly more. Some accounts say dozens died. And here's where Iranian mourning traditions became revolutionary. In Shia Islam, there are mourning ceremonies on the 40th day after a death. So 40 days after the Qom killings, people gathered to mourn, and those gatherings turned into more protests. More people were killed. 40 days later, more protests, more deaths. Another 40 days, more protests. This cycle of mourning and protest, every 40 days, created a rhythm to the revolution. Each cycle brought more people into the streets. What started with students in one city spread to workers, shopkeepers, professionals across the entire country. By August 1978, protests were massive. On August 19th, the 25th anniversary of the CIA coup that had brought the Shah to power, a mysterious fire broke out in a cinema in the city of Abadan. The doors were locked. Nearly 400 people burned to death. The opposition blamed SAVAK. The government blamed terrorists. Nobody knew the truth, but it didn't matter. People believed the government was capable of burning its own citizens alive. The protests grew, larger. The Shah tried to respond. In September, he declared martial law in Tehran and other major cities. Protests were banned. The military was deployed. On September 8th, thousands of protesters gathered in Jaleh Square in Tehran, defying the martial law order. They didn't know that the military had orders to shoot if necessary. When the crowds refused to disperse, soldiers opened fire. The official death toll was 87. Opposition sources claimed hundreds were killed. Either way, it was a massacre. Iranians call it Black Friday. Black Friday changed everything. After that day, there was no going back. The Shah had ordered his military to shoot his own people. The middle class, which had been hesitant, now joined the protests. Even parts of the military began to waver. How many times could soldiers be asked to shoot protesters? By late 1978, Iran was paralyzed. Oil workers went on strike, crippling the economy. Government employees stopped working. Banks closed. The country was grinding to a halt. The Shah was trapped. If he used overwhelming force, he might win in the short term, but he'd have to massacre thousands, maybe tens of thousands of his own people. The Americans were urging him to avoid violence. His own commanders were telling him the military wouldn't hold if he ordered a major crackdown, but if he didn't use force, he would lose power. In December 1978, during the Shia holy month of Muharram, millions poured into the streets. Not thousands, millions. In Tehran alone, estimates ranged from 1 to 2 million people marching, chanting "Death to the Shah," demanding an Islamic republic. It was over. The Shah knew it was over. On January 16, 1979, he left Iran, officially for medical treatment, but everyone knew he was never coming back. When Iranians heard the news, they flooded the streets in celebration. Strangers hugged each other. People climbed on top of buses and cars. They tore down statues of the Shah's father. They ransacked symbols of the monarchy. After 37 years of autocratic rule, the King of Kings had fled his kingdom, and 2 weeks later, on February 1, 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Iran. If you're finding this story as fascinating as I am, consider dropping a like on this video. It genuinely helps the channel reach more people who love history. And we're just getting to the most dramatic part. Now, back to February 1979 and Khomeini's return. The plane carrying Ayatollah Khomeini landed in Tehran on February 1st, 1979. Millions of people lined the route from the airport to the cemetery where he would give his first speech. Some estimates say 3 to 5 million people came out that day. In a country of about 35 million, that's absolutely staggering. Think about the logistics. No social media, no instant communication. Just word of mouth, mosques announcing the news, people telling their neighbors, and millions showed up. Khomeini was 76 years old. He'd been in exile for 15 years. When Western journalists asked him how he felt about returning to Iran after so long, about seeing his homeland again, he gave a one-word answer in Persian. Hichi. Nothing. I feel nothing. That coldness shocked people. Wasn't this supposed to be an emotional moment? But Khomeini's response wasn't arrogance. It was focus. He wasn't sentimental about his return because he had work to do. The Shah was gone, but the revolution wasn't complete. The old government was still technically in power. The military was still intact, still armed, still organized. Political rivals were maneuvering for position. Khomeini needed to consolidate power, and he needed to do it quickly before the revolutionary coalition fell apart. Here's where the story gets complicated, because the Iranian Revolution was never just one movement with one goal. It was a coalition of different groups with radically different visions for Iran's future. They'd united to get rid of the Shah, but they had completely different ideas about what should come next. The leftists, including the Communist Tudeh Party and groups like the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, wanted socialism. They talked about redistributing wealth, nationalizing industries, workers' councils. They saw the revolution as the first step toward a Marxist state. The liberals, mostly middle-class intellectuals, professionals, and moderate clerics, wanted democracy. They envisioned a secular or semi-secular republic with free elections, civil liberties, rule of law. They wanted Iran to look something like France or India, a modern democracy that happened to have a Muslim population. The religious conservatives, led by Khomeini and his circle of trusted ayatollahs, wanted an Islamic state. But not just an Islamic state in the sense that most Muslim-majority countries are Islamic states. Khomeini had developed a specific theory called velayat-e-faqih, or guardianship of the jurist. The idea was that in the absence of the hidden imam, a figure in Shia theology who disappeared centuries ago and will return at the end of times, religious scholars should rule society. Not just advise, rule. Then you had other groups. The bazaar merchants wanted economic policies that favored small business and traditional commerce. The ethnic minorities, Kurds and Arabs and others, wanted autonomy or at least recognition. Women who'd protested against the Shah wanted rights and freedoms. Everyone wanted something different. Khomeini understood this, and he was smarter than all of them. In the early months after his return, he spoke in broad terms about justice, independence, and Islam. He didn't immediately reveal exactly what kind of government he wanted. He let different groups think he supported their vision. It was a brilliant political strategy. Within 2 weeks of his return, fighting broke out in Tehran. Parts of the military and police, still loyal to the old regime or just trying to maintain order, clashed with revolutionary forces. Armed groups had formed among the revolutionaries, some connected to leftist organizations, others to religious groups. For a few days, Tehran was a war zone. Machine gun fire in the streets, buildings burning, nobody in full control, but key military units made the decisive choice. The Immortals, an elite Imperial Guard division that was supposed to protect the regime, chose not to fight. Other units began defecting, bringing their weapons to the revolutionaries. Junior officers disobeyed their commanders. On February 11, 1979, the Military Supreme Council declared neutrality. They would not fight for the old government. They would not intervene. That was it. The old government collapsed. Prime Minister Shapur Bakhtiar, who the Shah had appointed on his way out as a last-ditch attempt at reform, went into hiding and eventually fled to Paris. The revolutionaries took control of government buildings. The old regime was finished. Khomeini moved quickly to establish a new political system. He proposed something that had never existed before, an Islamic republic. Iran would have elections, a parliament, a president, democratic elements, but above all of that would be a supreme leader, a senior religious scholar who would have final say on all major decisions. Guardian of the revolution, guardian of Islam. And of course, that supreme leader would be Khomeini himself. The liberals and leftists who'd fought alongside religious conservatives suddenly realized they'd been outmaneuvered. They'd wanted democracy. They were getting theocracy. In March 1979, a referendum was held. People voted yes or no on the question, Islamic Republic? The yes vote won with over 98%. But many Iranians later said they thought they were just voting to end the monarchy, not to establish religious rule. Others said the vote wasn't really free. But it didn't matter. The Islamic Republic was official. Then came the purges. Khomeini's Revolutionary Guard started arresting people from the old regime. Show trials were held. Hundreds were executed, including former prime ministers, generals, and SAVAK agents. Some executions were justified by any standard, SAVAK torturers who'd brutalized prisoners. But many others were summary executions, people shot after quick trials with little evidence. The revolution was eating its own, too. Liberal politicians who'd opposed the Shah found themselves sidelined. Leftist groups who'd fought in the streets discovered that the new government had no place for them. Women who'd protested against the Shah were told they had to wear the hijab. The new regime was more restrictive than anyone had imagined. But through all of this, one issue kept Iran and the revolutionary government in the international spotlight: what to do about the Shah. After leaving Iran, the Shah had bounced around like an unwanted guest. First Egypt, where President Anwar Sadat welcomed him out of personal loyalty. Then Morocco, where King Hassan II gave him refuge. Then the Bahamas. Then Mexico. He was stateless, a king without a kingdom, desperately ill and trying to find some place that would take him. The Shah had cancer, specifically non-Hodgkin's lymphoma that had been secretly treated for years while he was still in power. He needed advanced medical treatment. And in October 1979, his advisors and supporters, including former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and banking chairman David Rockefeller, lobbied President Jimmy Carter to let the Shah come to the United States for treatment. Carter was reluctant. His advisors in the State Department and his ambassador in Tehran all warned him that allowing the Shah into America would provoke a massive reaction in Iran. The revolutionaries were already paranoid about American intentions. Letting the Shah in would confirm their worst fears. But Carter was also under domestic political pressure. The Shah had been America's ally for decades. Was America really going to abandon a dying ally who just needed medical care? Carter eventually gave in. On October 22, 1979, the Shah arrived in New York for treatment at a hospital. It was a humanitarian gesture. The Shah was genuinely dying of cancer, but for many Iranians it was a betrayal and a threat. They were convinced the Americans were using the medical excuse to plot reinstalling the Shah, just like they had in 1953 with the coup. The historical parallel was too strong, too obvious to ignore. The CIA had done it before. Why wouldn't they do it again? On November 4, 1979, a group of Iranian students who called themselves Students Following the Imam's Line, meaning they supported Khomeini, gathered outside the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. The embassy was a large compound with multiple buildings surrounded by walls. It was, technically, U.S. sovereign territory under international law. The students had demonstrated there before, but this time was different. At around 10:30 in the morning, they stormed the gates. They climbed walls, broke through barriers, pushed past the Iranian guards who were supposed to be protecting the compound. Within hours, they had taken control of the entire embassy. 66 Americans were in the embassy that day. Most were diplomats, but there were also military liaison officers, CIA staff, administrative personnel. Some managed to escape in the chaos. 6 Americans made it out and ended up at the Canadian embassy, where they hid for months before being smuggled out using fake Canadian passports. That became its own famous story, eventually turned into the movie Argo. But 52 Americans were captured and held hostage. The students blindfolded them, tied their hands, and paraded them in front of cameras. They ransacked the embassy looking for documents. They found classified files and started releasing them to the public, showing evidence of CIA activities in Iran, which only inflamed anti-American sentiment more. At first, many people, including some in the U.S. government, thought it would be resolved quickly. Student protests sometimes got out of hand. The government would intervene and end it. But that's not what happened. Khomeini saw an opportunity. The hostage crisis unified Iranians behind the revolution at a moment when the revolutionary coalition was fracturing. It made America the clear enemy. It gave him a way to purge remaining moderates from the government by accusing anyone who wanted to negotiate as being soft on America, as being potential traitors. So instead of ordering the students to release the hostages, Khomeini publicly supported them. He called the embassy a den of spies. He said the students were defending the revolution. The crisis dragged on. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. President Carter tried everything. Negotiations through intermediaries, economic sanctions, freezing Iranian assets, diplomatic pressure through the United Nations. Nothing worked. The revolutionary government kept moving the goalposts. First, they demanded the Shah be returned to Iran to stand trial. Then they wanted an apology for the 1953 coup. Then they wanted billions in frozen assets released. The hostages were split up and moved to different locations. Some were held in the embassy. Others were moved to prisons, to houses, to other buildings around Tehran. They were interrogated, threatened, sometimes beaten. Some were kept in solitary confinement for months. They were subjected to mock executions, told they would be killed, then spared at the last moment. Several hostages later described the psychological torture as worse than the physical abuse. In April 1980, Carter authorized a military rescue mission. It was called Operation Eagle Claw. The plan was complex. Helicopters would fly from an aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf, cross into Iran, land at a remote desert location called Desert 1, refuel from transport planes, then fly to a hiding spot near Tehran. The next night, they'd assault the embassy, rescue the hostages, and fly them out. The mission was a disaster from the start. The helicopters encountered unexpected weather, thick clouds of dust that damaged equipment. One helicopter had hydraulic problems and had to turn back. Another had instrument failures. By the time they reached Desert 1, only 6 of the 8 helicopters were functional. The mission required a minimum of 6. They were at the bare minimum. Then, as they prepared to refuel in the desert, a helicopter collided with a transport plane. Both aircraft burst into flames. 8 American servicemen died in the explosion. The mission commander decided to abort. They destroyed the remaining helicopters to prevent them from falling into Iranian hands and flew out in the transport planes. The next morning, Iranian forces found the wreckage at Desert 1. They displayed the burned bodies of the American servicemen on television. They paraded the destroyed helicopters. The failed rescue made America look weak and incompetent. It made Khomeini look stronger, as if God himself had protected Iran from American aggression. The hostages themselves learned about the rescue attempt from their captors, who moved them again, dispersed them further, made rescue even more impossible. The students holding the hostages became heroes of the revolution. The whole episode humiliated the United States and destroyed Carter's presidency. Ronald Reagan would win the 1980 election partly by criticizing Carter's handling of Iran. The hostages were finally released on January 20th, 1981, the day Reagan was inaugurated as president. They'd been held for 444 days. Some of them had been beaten, kept in isolation, subjected to mock executions. It was a trauma that shaped an entire generation of Americans' view of Iran. And from that moment, the United States and Iran were enemies, not just political rivals. Enemies. The Great Satan versus the Islamic Republic. We're in the final stretch of this story, but before we wrap up, if you're not subscribed to this channel yet, consider joining us. Every week there's a new deep dive into history like this one. Now let's talk about what all of this meant for the Middle East and the world. The Iranian Revolution didn't just change Iran and U.S.-Iran relations. It changed the entire region. And many of those changes are still playing out today. First, Iraq. Saddam Hussein watched the revolution in Iran with alarm. He saw a Shia religious government coming to power right next door. Iraq had a majority Shia population too, and Saddam, a Sunni, feared they might rise up inspired by Iran. He also saw opportunity. Iran's military was in chaos after the revolution. So in September 1980, Saddam invaded Iran, starting the Iran-Iraq War. That war lasted 8 years and killed somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people. It was brutal, with chemical weapons, human wave attacks, and trench warfare that looked like World War I. The United States supported Saddam during that war, seeing him as a counterweight to revolutionary Iran. That support for Saddam is another grievance Iranians hold against America. Second, Lebanon. Iran helped create Hezbollah, a Shia militia and political party in Lebanon, in the 1980s. Hezbollah became a proxy for Iranian influence in the region. Today, Hezbollah is one of the most powerful military forces in Lebanon and a key Iranian ally. Third, the broader Middle East. The Iranian Revolution inspired Islamist movements across the region. If religious leadership could overthrow the Shah in Iran, maybe it could take power elsewhere too. You can draw a line from the Iranian Revolution to the rise of political Islam throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Fourth, the global balance of power. Iran went from being America's closest ally in the Persian Gulf to being its adversary. That shift had consequences for oil markets, for regional security, for the Cold War dynamics. The Soviets tried to take advantage of the chaos, which partly contributed to their decision to invade Afghanistan in 1979. And fifth, the model of revolution itself. The Iranian Revolution showed that a popular uprising could overthrow a seemingly powerful, well-armed authoritarian regime. That lesson wasn't lost on other countries. Both protesters and governments learned from what happened in Iran. But here's something that often gets overlooked. The revolution also destroyed lives. Thousands were executed during and after the revolution. Hundreds of thousands died in the war. With Iraq, millions of Iranians went into exile, creating one of the largest diaspora communities in the world. Political freedoms that had existed under the Shah, limited as they were replaced with even more restrictions under the Islamic Republic. The story of the Iranian Revolution is not a simple morality tale. The Shah was a dictator who relied on a brutal secret police and served American interests over his own people's welfare. But Khomeini's Islamic Republic turned out to be authoritarian in different ways, with its own prisons, its own executions, its own repression. Many Iranians, especially those who lived through the revolution, will tell you they traded one form of autocracy for another. the promise of freedom that drove millions into the streets in 1978 was never truly fulfilled. And the relationship between Iran and the United States, which seemed so solid in the 1970s when the Shah was America's ally, became one of the most hostile in the world. It's been more than 45 years since the revolution. There are Iranians and Americans alive today who weren't even born when the hostages were taken. But the enmity continues. Trade embargoes, sanctions, proxy conflicts in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, assassinations of Iranian scientists, Iranian support for militias that attack American forces. The confrontation between these two countries has shaped the Middle East for nearly half a century, and it all traces back to those months in 1978 and 1979 when a king fled, an Ayatollah returned, and a revolution changed the world. So, to sum up, in 1953, the CIA helped overthrow Iran's democratically elected prime minister and gave absolute power to the Shah. The Shah ruled for 37 years, modernizing Iran but creating resentment through authoritarianism, corruption, and his close ties to America. By 1978, that resentment exploded into revolution. Protests built on 40-day mourning cycles until millions were in the streets. The Shah ordered a massacre on Black Friday, but it only made things worse. In January 1979, he fled. Khomeini returned from exile and quickly consolidated power, establishing the Islamic Republic. In November 1979, Iranian students took American diplomats hostage for 444 days. That crisis severed U.S.-Iran relations and created an enmity that persists to this day. The most ironic part? The United States helped create the very regime it ended up opposing. By backing the Shah so strongly, by organizing the 1953 coup, by supporting his autocratic rule, America fed the resentment that fueled the revolution. And that revolution brought to power a government far more hostile to American interests than Mossadegh ever was. Sometimes the consequences of our actions take decades to reveal themselves. The CIA officers who organized the 1953 coup probably never imagined they were setting in motion a chain of events that would lead to the Islamic Republic, the hostage crisis, and 45 years of conflict. History doesn't move in straight lines. It zigzags, doubles back, and surprises us. The Shah thought he was creating a modern, Western-aligned Iran that would last for generations. Instead, his modernization without freedom, his reliance on Savak's terror, and his alliance with America created the conditions for his own downfall. And that makes us wonder, how many of today's alliances and policies will look, in hindsight, like the seeds of tomorrow's conflicts? And that's the story of how Iran and America became enemies. If you made it to the end, thank you. Seriously. Videos like this take a lot of research and effort, and knowing there are people who watch all the way through makes it worthwhile. If you found this informative, subscribe to the channel. Every week there's a new video diving deep into historical events that shaped our world. Next week, I'll be covering the Suez Crisis of 1956, another pivotal moment in Middle Eastern history that most people know about but don't really understand. Drop a comment below. Did you know this history? Were you surprised by any part of the Iranian Revolution story? Is there another Middle Eastern conflict you'd like me to cover? Until next time, stay curious about history. It's the best way to understand the present.